battlefield is not always a place of blood and iron alone. Sometimes it becomes a stage where destiny itself writes the script, where a single figure rises out of obscurity and changes the fate of nations. Imagine the air thick with smoke banners whipping in the wind, the ground trembling beneath thousands of marching feet. And in the center of this chaos, a young woman armored in steel, mounted upon a white horse, her gaze locked upon the horizon. Her name would echo across the centuries. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl from Domrémy who became the unexpected flame of hope for a weary kingdom. The story does not begin with victory. It begins with a whisper, a vision, and a voice that no one else could hear but her. Joan was born in 1412 in a small rural village in northeastern France. During one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history, France was caught in the grip of the 100 Years' War, ravaged by English domination and civil unrest. The countryside burned, villages were sacked, and the rightful king, Charles VII, was little more than a claimant to a throne he could not secure. The people despaired, their faith in victory fading into ash. But destiny often chooses unlikely vessels, and in Joan, destiny found a girl who could neither read nor write, but who carried a spirit unshakable and a conviction like steel. From the age of 13, Joan claimed to hear voices. Celestial guides she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she said, gave her purpose. They told her to drive the English from France and to see Charles crowned at Reims, where kings of France had been anointed for centuries. To the world, she was a mere peasant, a girl with no training, no noble blood, and no claim to authority. Yet within her grew a certainty that no ridicule, no threat, and no doubt could shake. She began to insist she was chosen by God himself to lead armies and deliver her people. At first, her words were dismissed, even mocked. What sense could it make? A teenage girl in armor commanding men hardened by war. But her conviction was relentless. She approached local leaders, churchmen, nobles, and finally, Charles VII himself. Imagine this moment. A weary king, defeated time and again, humiliated by a rival crowned in Paris, faced with a girl who insisted she could bring him victory. Yet Charles, surrounded by desperation, gave her a chance. They tested her purity, her devotion, her knowledge of faith, and though the clergy remained cautious, her determination was impossible to ignore. Soon, armor was forged for her, and she was placed at the head of troops who had lost all hope. When Joan rode into battle for the first time at Orléans in 1429, the French were exhausted, their city under siege by the English for months. Soldiers who had expected to die in despair suddenly found themselves looking upon a figure unlike any they had ever seen. She rode clad in white armor, carrying a banner instead of a sword, a symbol of purity and divine mission. Her presence was not merely martial, it was spiritual. She rallied men not with threats, but with faith, with the belief that victory was certain if they trusted in God and in France. Under her leadership, the French forces surged with new energy. Within days, the siege of Orléans was lifted, a turning point that transformed the war and set the stage for France's revival. Word spread like wildfire. The Maid of Orléans, as she became known, was no longer a nameless peasant girl. She was a figure of legend, a living miracle who had achieved what countless generals had failed to accomplish. The morale of France soared, while English forces trembled at the thought of facing her again. Joan's banner became a beacon, her voice a command that carried weight far beyond her years. Wherever she rode, soldiers followed, convinced that God was with her. But victory at Orléans was not the end. Joan pressed for a far greater goal, the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. For centuries, French kings had been crowned there, their legitimacy tied not only to politics, but to sacred tradition. Yet the city lay deep within territory, threatened by English forces. To march, there was madness, unless one believed that Providence itself would clear the path. Joan believed with every breath. She urged Charles to move forward, to claim his destiny. And so they marched. Along the way, towns and cities surrendered, not to the power of swords, but to the overwhelming wave of faith and momentum Joan had unleashed. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned in Reims Cathedral, with Joan at his side, holding her banner high. For the people of France, it was a vision of salvation, proof that God had not abandoned them. Joan, the peasant girl who once herded sheep in Domrémy, now stood beside a king, her mission fulfilled, or so it seemed. Yet destiny is never without tragedy. Politics, envy, and suspicion began to corrode Joan's influence. Powerful men in Charles's court distrusted her. Fearing her growing fame and spiritual authority, she was captured in 1430 near Compiègne by Burgundian allies of the English, abandoned by those who should have ransomed her. Sold to her enemies, she became a prisoner, subjected to interrogation and trial. The English and their clerical supporters sought not only to condemn her, but to discredit the very idea that God had chosen her. Her trial was brutal, a theater of power disguised as justice. They accused her of heresy, witchcraft, of dressing like a man, of claiming divine authority. She stood against them, alone, without defenders, answering questions with remarkable wit, courage, and defiance. She spoke not as a child of peasants, but as one who believed every word she uttered came from heaven. Yet the outcome was inevitable. In 1431, at only 19 years old, Joan of Arc was condemned to death. She was led to the stake in Rouen, clothed in white, her head shaven, her faith unbroken. The crowd wept, some out of sorrow, others out of shame. As the flames consumed her, she called out the name of Jesus, her final word echoing into the sky. Witnesses swore that a dove rose above the smoke, and even some of her enemies trembled. But death was not the end of her story. Her ashes were cast into the river, yet her legacy could not be drowned. France would rise, the English would retreat, and the girl they burned as a heretic would, centuries later, be canonized as a saint. Joan of Arc became not only a national heroine of France, but a symbol of courage, faith, and the unyielding power of conviction. Her image still rides through history, a teenage girl in gleaming armor, raising a banner high, her voice urging soldiers to believe in the impossible. She embodies the truth that greatness is not bound by birth or gender, but by the strength of spirit and the willingness to stand firm against all odds. The world remembers her not merely as a warrior, but as a beacon, a flame that refused to be extinguished. Each generation finds in her story a reflection of its own struggles, a reminder that even in the darkest night, one person's light can set a nation ablaze. And as long as banners wave, as long as people dream of freedom, the figure of Joan on her white horse, charging into the storm of history, will remain immortal.